Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my sincere thanks to the co-hosts, the Indian Council on Global Relations and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy for this privilege to speak at this distinguished and timely event. I am indeed very happy for the opportunity to share with you my views on how and where the G20 can help build consensus on issues of critical importance to developing countries. Coming from the WTO, I suppose you can easily guess my answer, which is quite short and straightforward. Nothing is more important for developing countries today than the maintenance and strengthening of the multilateral trading system. Developing countries are the fastest rising trade powers. Their economies are the most dependent on global trade. And they are the ones who are most reliant on the rules of the multilateral trading system to keep world markets open and to level the trade playing field. Signs of sluggish global trade growth, rising protectionist sentiments, and waning enthusiasm for multilateralism in certain quarters should be deeply worrying, to say the least, for developing countries. Under these circumstances, where G20 members and the experts gathered in this room can help developing countries most is by demonstrating in actions as well as words their firm commitment to an open world trading system underpinned by a strong and effective WTO. The fastest rising trade powers today are not the advanced economies of Europe or North America, even though they too remain bigger traders, but the developing economies of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The developing world's share of global trade has grown from less than a third in 1980 to nearly half today, and at current trends, their share is likely to continue to grow in the foreseeable future. China, to take the most obvious example, is now the world's largest exporter. 30 years ago, it only ranked 32nd. While emerging export giants like India and China have captured the lion's share of global attention, the story of the developing world's rapid trade rise includes countries of all sizes and regions. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Madagascar have seen their exports surge since 2010, and in relative terms, far exceeded even the impressive performance of China. With their growing integration into the global economy, developing countries' reliance on trade, both imports and exports, continues to rise. Trade now accounts for over 35% of developing countries' economic output on average, compared to 25% for advanced countries, making them the most trade-dependent economies. This is not just because export markets have become more open, but also because many developing countries have dramatically lowered their import barriers. In an era when two-thirds of world trade now takes place within global production networks, and developing countries' ability to increase exports hinges directly on increasing imports, open, efficient, and seamless connectivity to world markets is very essential. And this is only not just for increasing trade, but also for attracting foreign investment, technology, and other factors of production that are critical for the continued growth and development of developing countries. As developing countries' share of and dependence on world trade has grown, so too has their reliance on the multilateral trading system. In the GATT era, the industrialized economies largely dominated the system. Today, the emerging economies like India, China, and Brazil play a role that was unimaginable even 20 years ago. Dozens of other developing countries are today contributing actively and constructively to a system in which they have a growing stake. The biggest change is also in mindsets. More and more, developing countries have come to see increased trade, more open markets, and a stronger WTO as core development issues, pivotal to their continued growth and progress. And they are relying less and less on protectionism as a viable development strategy, not only because it punishes their citizens by inflating the price of their necessities like food, energy, and clothing, but because it also handicaps their industries and entrepreneurs. They cannot hope to compete in global markets without access to world-priced inputs, efficient services, and modern technology. It is therefore no coincidence that the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals highlight the need to significantly increase the exports of developing countries, and especially to promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the WTO. Trade is the only condition for development today, but it is also, trade is not only a condition for development today, but it is also a necessary condition, which explains why increasingly outward-oriented developing countries are also making enormous strides in improved health, education attainment, living standards, and poverty reduction. Let me be clear. The developing world's continued economic progress hinges, perhaps above all, on maintaining an open world trading system. Developing countries need stronger multilateral trade rules, not weaker ones. More trade liberalization, not less, and more global policy cooperation, not more isolation in bilateral or regional blocs. While regional agreements can complement the multilateral trading system, they cannot be substitutes. By design, they are discriminatory, risking the diversion of trade and investment and the marginalization of those left outside. They can create overlapping and inconsistent rules, thereby increasing trade costs, increasing complexity, and adding to uncertainty. And they tend to increase the leverage of the strongest trade powers at the expense of the weakest or smallest, which is why many developing countries should embrace them with a caution. And since regional trade agreements, by definition, lack the global coverage and membership of the WTO, they are inherently limited in their ability to address growing global trade challenges, from disciplined subsidies to regulating digital trade. This is why the strong emphasis of this year's German G20 presidency, like last year's Chinese presidency, on strengthening the multilateral trading system is so important. Issues like further liberalizing agricultural trade, reducing industrial tariffs, and tackling non-tariff barriers obviously remain of central importance to developing countries. But likewise, digital trade, services liberalization, and investment facilitation remain key priorities of the German presidency and are also fast emerging as key development issues too. Indeed, the distinction between developing and advanced country negotiating issues is becoming narrower, if not blurred, in the light of developing world's rise to trade prominence and their need for coherent approaches across numerous policy areas, including global integration. In reality, development is now a core objective and an inherent part of everything that the WTO does. I do not need to remind this distinguished audience about the major challenges the system now faces and the costs of complacency. 2016 marked the fifth consecutive year with trade growth below 3%, a situation seen only once before the past 70 years. Weak growth in major economies and weak investment in particular has played a major role. But so too has the slowing pace of global trade liberalization, coupled with the steady accumulation of protectionist measures. The latest WTO G20 monitoring report shows that the number of trade restrictive measures in place remains high and that their rollback, a long-standing commitment by the G20, remains slow. The report warns that G20 economies must redouble their efforts and resolve this. It is true that anti-trade and anti-globalization sentiments seem to be gaining traction, especially in several key advanced countries. This was one of the main issues discussed by leaders at the recent G20 summit in Hangzhou, and is now a central item in the agenda of the Trade and Investment Working Group under the German G20 presidency. The WTO, the IMF, and World Bank are working on a discussion paper that will show the benefits that will flow from further trade integration. The paper will also highlight that there is no gain from trade in terms of better jobs and higher growth without the pain of structural transformation and diversification as capital and labor are reallocated across firms and sectors. Let me therefore conclude with the observation that in today's integrated, multipolar, hyper-connected world economy, the multilateral trading system is becoming more and more not less important for both developing and developed countries. But this also means that costs of failure are higher. with ramifications that could be felt more widely. We must continue to make the case for global trade and for the multilateral trading system that underpins it. Because we don't do this regularly and periodically, we open the door to a rather uncertain future. This is where the consensus building work of the T20 and prestigious bodies like the Indian Council on Global Relations and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy is so critically important. History reminds us that today's multilateral trading system grew out of the disastrous failures of the 1930s with its protectionist wars, rival regional blocs, and ruinous trade wars. History also teaches us that it was the power of an idea that global peace could only be achieved through shared global prosperity and development, which underpinned the enormous success of today's global order. I share the view that we forget those lessons at our own peril. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Agah. I would like to invite, actually, maybe we have time, we run out of time, but if there is any burning questions, we can take, maybe squeeze in one or two, and then I'd like to come to you, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh. But maybe, yes, Pranav.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, thank you, Ambassador Agah, for his very eloquent speech. I have a question with regards to trade facilitation agreement, which is soon going to be implemented. Only 2 ratifications are needed, and it's just a matter of few days. But my general concern is that those trade facilitation in goods, it was very hard sold to the world that it will help in realizing $1.3 trillion of gain once implemented. But how this gain is to be realized when the voice of protectionism in key markets like US and Europe is getting stronger? Thank you.
Well, I think we need to understand the fact that, like all WTO agreements, the trade facilitation agreement remains only an opportunity. It depends on how members adjust their domestic policies to fit with the multilateral disciplines that they have agreed to under the trade facilitation agreement. It's not a silver bullet to all the problems of trade and regional integration. It needs to be complemented by what members do. And I believe if that should happen, which you see a lot across the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, where trade costs would go down due to the effective implementation of the agreement, and subsequently greater opportunities for businesses in both imports and exports. And I say this because whereas many think that imports are bad, you will discover that there is no successful exporting country in the world that does not import more. That's the trade data that supports this. So I know that, like all WTO agreements, you cannot expect the same level of compliance across the membership. But the fact that the TFA is designed in a particular way that takes into account the special economic and political circumstances of the members, I hope that this will encourage implementation and a greater benefit cumulatively to the rest of the membership. But you also know that throughout history, the sharing of the benefits of trade remains a constant controversial issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranav. And Mr. Agah, we're really out of time, but one more question. Oh, Stormy, yes.
Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I'm Stormy Milner from the V20. While I absolutely agree that trade is paramount for inclusivity, economic growth, and also development, I would like to hear a little bit more about investment, specifically foreign direct investment, which is also on the agenda of the Trade and Investment Working Group, specifically investment facilitation. And I would be interested if there's any chance to reintegrate that issue into the WTO talks more strongly. I know it's not very likely, but still I would like to hear a little bit more on that issue. Thank you.
Well, maybe what I say now is my personal opinion, because there is no clear WTO work program on investment per se, except some of the elements that you may find under the trade in services agreements. I think for many of our countries, the challenge today is to recognize that you can no longer promote trade and investment flows on different tracks. Many of our policymakers do not seem to recognize that a lot of trade flows come out of investment flows and vice versa. So if you have that at the back of your mind, you may now begin to see how you use your trade and market opportunities to attract investment. And to attract investment is no longer about your border measures. It's what you do behind the border, which creates confidence, which opens up your market, which allows those segments of the production networks to relocate their facilities in your country. You may have heard about the concept of domestic reform for more factories. How you balance that at the policy level, at the national level, is the issue. So if members remain open to the idea that the growing reality today is that they cannot separate their investment flows from trade flows, perhaps going forward they can begin to look at how to develop, maybe even if it is the trade facilitation type agreement around investment that reinforces how they benefit from their participation in trade. That is up to them. The Secretariat can help in analyzing. I believe your think tanks can also contribute. As a matter of fact, what we have tried to do now in the Economic Research and Statistics Division is to begin to look for expertise outside the Secretariat to help in doing those research, analysis, and policy advocacies that can bring clarity as to the connections of these issues and the ability of countries to all benefit from the trading system.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to stop there, but I really appreciate the Q&A as well, Mr. Agah, and for coming.